What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Magicka Sorcerer. Specifically, this is going to be a non-pet build, so we're not going to be focusing in on using the pets at all. So this is going to be a build that can be used in any single fight in the game, because pets do have a couple of weird quirks about them. They're not going to be very useful for every single fight in the game. A good example of this would be the mage. They do spread chain lightning, so it's usually recommended that you don't bring a pet into the mage fight. Another good example would be this Zhasha. The pets can die to Zhasha's kind of field blast during the when you have to hide behind the pillars. Then like Assembly General, if the pet is attacking the Assembly General during his invulnerability phase when he's in the center there, then you yourself are going to die, because basically the Assembly General reflects all the damage that your pet is doing right back at you. So you definitely want to have a non-pet build if you are going to be playing a Magicka Sorcerer as a DPS class, as your main DPS class. So just like the rest of our build videos, we'll be going over gear, skills, race, attributes, everything you can think of about this build. We'll talk about kind of a rotation, do a little bit of a demonstration, kind of what you should be prioritizing and what you should be looking at while you're doing your rotation. We'll talk about some gear alternatives if you don't have certain pieces of gear. And then finally, we'll top things off with a 6 million dummy parse, so you guys can get a full sense of the rotation that you should be doing, as well as the amount of DPS that you'll be able to expect to pull using this build and how it compares to other Magicka DPS classes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. First with the gear. So we are going to be playing at range, so we are basically going to be a range DPS. So we will not be within melee range. So basically that's where basically excludes Zaan, which is a very powerful monster set, and it also excludes Rearming Trap, which does help out our sustain a little bit, just because it's using stamina instead of Magicka. So for our monster helm set, we're going to go with Ilambris. Ilambris, you can obtain this from Crypt of Hearts 1 on Vet. It's a very easy dungeon, so it's a pretty easy set to obtain. The one downside of using Ilambris is that when it does proc, it basically, the proc doesn't move with the boss. So if you're fighting a very mobile boss, for example, Felms or Olms, or basically any of the bosses really in Asylum, Ilambris does lose a little bit of power there, because a lot of its strength relies on the boss not moving out of those two procs. If you are fighting a mobile fight, then you might want to consider using Skoria instead. Skoria can be obtained from City of Ash 2. The advantage of Skoria, let me just pull up Skoria real quick. The advantage of running Skoria is that when you do happen to deal damage, it deals it all in one blow, so you don't have to worry about the boss standing within your proc circle in order to deal the most amount of damage. Another thing with Skoria is, because it does have a max health as the one piece, you don't have to have a max health enchant like I have here on my Ilambris helm right now. Basically, you can replace that health enchant with a Magicka enchant instead, so you do get a little bit of extra Magicka back and a little bit of extra health if you are going to be using Skoria instead of Ilambris. Now for our first 5-piece set, this set is going to be active on basically both bars, so this is all armor pieces, either your armor or your jewelry pieces, and it's going to be Sirorias. We have perfect Sirorias here, but you can go with the imperfect version. The difference between the perfect and imperfect versions is that 5-piece max Magicka bonus is only present when you have 5 perfect gear pieces. Otherwise, you lose that max Magicka bonus. Siroria is a very strong set here, mainly because of that 5-piece effect. So whenever you deal direct damage with a single target ability, you basically create a ring that lasts for 10 seconds, and when you stand in that ring, it grants you a stack of Siroria's boon every 1 second, and that boon lasts for 5 seconds. Each stack basically increases your spell damage by 30, and you can get up to 20 stacks for a maximum spell damage boost of 600. Now, the downside of Siroria is that you do have to be within that ring at least every 5 seconds, or 4 seconds ideally, in order to maintain your stacks. If you lose your stacks, you lose all of them all at once. So for more mobile fights, you're going to need to be a little bit more conscious of where that ring is, and you have to be able to step back into it within 3 or 4 seconds in order to maintain your stacks. But once you step into the ring, that 5 seconds is refreshed. So for very mobile fights, Siroria is not going to be very strong here. There's only a handful of fights in the game where you're not going to have very good uptime on Siroria. For example, Zhasha, because you're playing the curse mechanic, Twins in Maw, because you have to play the color swap mechanics. or caught. If you're a runner, if you're running back room, then it's not going to be quite as strong there. Or if you're a kiter potentially, and then there's a few fights that it's not going to be as useful, but it's still going to be pretty strong. So, for example, Asylum and Cloud Rest, even though they're mobile fights, you're able to basically kind of play around that mobility and basically run back into the ring every 3 or 4 seconds in those phases where you do have to run around a bit. So it is possible to kind of maintain fairly decent uptime on Siroria in those mobile fights as long as you're playing very smart and playing very tactically. So for instances where you might not be able to use Siroria, for example in VMA, you can replace Siroria with something like Moondancer or Julianos. Both of those sets are going to be pretty strong. Moondancer, you are reliant on synergies though, but you get very good sustain and very good damage using Moondancer as long as you're able to maintain those synergies and those blessings. Julianos, on the other hand, is a lot more consistent DPS, but it will usually end up being lower than Moondancer. Now for our 5-piece, this is going to be only active on our front bar, and you do have several options here. So I'm going with Burning Spellweave right here. So Burning Spellweave Inferno Staff. So this is a double Inferno build here. Other options that you could use instead of Burning Spellweave, for example, if you have one shock damage glyph, you could go with Mechanical Acuity instead. Mechanical Acuity is still very strong on Magicka Sorcerers, particularly non-pet sorcs, even though it was changed to only proc on direct damage. Mother Sorrow is another set that you might also want to consider using. This is a drop set from Zaan, so you are able to purchase these pieces off of guild traders. And this just gives you a lot of additional spell crit, so this is very useful as well, particularly if you are running double shock staves or you have a shock stave back bar. If you're going with double Inferno though, Burning Spellweave will typically pull ahead of both Mother Sorrow and Mechanical Acuity by a small amount. The difference is within 1000 DPS, usually less than that, so you can realistically go with any of these 3 sets and you'll still be very strong. And then of course the main set's going to be Siroria's here. And then for our back bar, we're still going with the Maelstrom Staff. Again, this is a double Inferno Staff build, so we do have an Inferno Staff back bar, but you can go with the Lightning Staff instead if you do have a Lightning Staff on your back bar there. Now for armor traits and enchants, we have all divines on all of our pieces here. We have max Magicka enchants across all of them. We do have one health glyph on our Ilambris head here. As long as that health glyph is on one of the large pieces, doesn't matter which piece you have it on. And this is because we are using Witch Mother's Potent Brew, so we do want that health piece in order to get our health up to at least a fairly acceptable level here. So we're at 16,360 health. Now for our jewelry enchants and traits, we have 2 Arcane and 1 Bloodthirsty. This is what I found to perform best overall in raids. You can go with 3 Bloodthirsty if you'd like, but the problem is if you have a lot of Bloodthirsty traits in your DPS group, then each Bloodthirsty trait actually does less and less damage because there's less time for it to be active. So the more Bloodthirsties you have, the kind of less effective it ends up being. I do have 1 Magicka regen glyph, and that's just to help out my recovery here, and then I have 2 spell damage glyphs here. Now for our front bar, it's an infused with a flame damage enchant with we're running Burning Spellweave, so we want as much fire damage as we possibly can. If you're running Mother Sorrow or Mechanical Acuity, you don't have to go with flame damage. You can go with a shock damage enchant instead. It's kind of up to you. You can go with either one of them. Another potential enchant you might want to consider is going to be the Absorb Magicka enchant. That helps out your sustain. Does deal less damage overall compared to fiery weapon as well as a shock damage enchant, but if you do have an Absorb Magicka enchant, then you could feasibly replace this regen glyph with a spell damage glyph, so that kind of makes up for the difference in damage when compared to the flame damage or shock damage glyphs. Then for our back bar, you can go with Infused or Nirnhoned. I prefer Infused with a weapon damage enchant. Basically, the decision between Infused and Nirnhoned is partially dependent on which trait you manage to get first. They're both pretty strong, but it's also going to be dependent on how often you're able to get onto your back bar. If you are on your back bar for a fairly decent amount of time, then Infused will end up being better. But if you are on your back bar, for example, in order to do heavy attacks and things like that, then Nirnhoned will pull out slightly ahead. With a shock staff, it might be better to use a Nirn trait instead of Infused trait, just for that extra AoE damage with your lightning heavy attacks, because it does scale off of your spell damage fairly decently compared to using Infused with a weapon damage enchant. Alright, so now let's move on to our character sheet here. I am a Breton, and this is just because I am on the PTS, so I do want to kind of mimic what I have on the live server right now. So my Sorc on live is a Breton, so we're sticking with Breton here. So Bretons get 10% max magicka, 3960 additional spell resistance, which helps out our survivability. As you can see here, we're sitting at almost 17,000 spell resistance. This is before any sort of resistance buffs. And then we have 3% cost reduction to our magicka based ability, so that helps out sustain by a little bit there. However, if you are going with the double Inferno Staff build on a Sorc, Dunmer are going to be the strongest choice. They get 9% additional max magicka, and then they get 7% additional flame damage, then 2% damage, added damage to their shock and frost damage. If you have a lightning staff or you're going with double lightning builds, then an Ultimer is going to pull ahead of a Dunmer. Ultimer get 10% max magicka, 9% additional magicka regen, and then 4% additional shock, flame, and frost damage. Even if you're going with a double Inferno Staff build, the High Elves are still going to be very, very close to Dunmer. The additional magicka regen they get is really, really strong. Again, don't ignore regen, your sustain. When it comes to DPS potential, having that additional 9% magicka regen is very, very powerful. So even if you're going with double Inferno Staff build, Dunmer pull ahead by only a very, very small margin, so High Elves are still, the Ultimate are still a very powerful race choice, regardless if you're going double Inferno or double Lightning. Now for our attributes, I have 64 points into magicka here. No points into health. We are kind of a little bit low on health, not too that bad though, 16,360 health. If you do feel like you need some additional survivability, then by all means shift a couple of points from magicka into health. You can shift about 4 or 5 points into health here to hit 17k health if you so desire. If you are experienced and know the trial mechanics and are comfortable with your survivability, then by all means go ahead with 64 points into magicka. For our Mundustone, we're going with the Apprentice here. This helps boost our spell damage by a decent amount. Now, if you are in a raid group that's not using Alkosh, you might want to consider using the Lover instead in order to hit the penetration cap. The Lover will add will make you go over by a little bit if you're not using Alkosh and you have Torg's Infused Crusher. I think you over penetrate by about 300 or 400 penetration, which is a small amount. It's a slight DPS loss, but you do want to hit that penetration cap by using the Lover instead. So if you do have Alkosh, then go with the Apprentice and make up the difference in penetration with CP. But if you don't have Alkosh, I found that using the Lover is about equal to using the Apprentice. So you can kind of pick which one you want if you don't have, if your group is not using Alkosh, if your tanks aren't using Alkosh. Now, for food, we're going with Witch Mother's Potent Brew. There is a Gold Food Clockwork Citrus Fillet, which is basically a slightly upgraded version of Witch Mother's Potent Brew that you can purchase off of Guild Traders or craft it yourself using Perfect Row. It is kind of expensive to buy, but if you can afford it, it is going to be a little bit more powerful than Witch Mother's Potent Brew. So we're using Witch instead of Blue Food because of that additional magicka regen. Magicka Sorcerers have the worst regen when it comes to all the different magicka DPS classes and specs, so we definitely need to use Witch Mothers in order to maintain good sustain, so that way we aren't losing that much DPS due to heavy attacking very often. And downside of using Witch Mothers instead of Blue Food is that we do lose some max magicka. We lose about 2k max magicka, and we do lose some max health. We do lose about 1.5k max health compared to using Blue Food, so that's kind of why the downside of using Witch Mothers. We have to use a health enchant, and if we even with the health enchant, we end up having lower health overall. So that's kind of the weakness of Witch Mothers. Now going over our skills, starting off with our front bar, we have Crystal Frags, Elemental Weapon. You can use Force Pulse or Crushing Shock instead. It really is dependent on you. Force Pulse or Crushing Shock is going to be overall lower sustain compared to Elemental Weapon, but you'll be pulling very similar DPS. It's a pretty small difference overall. I prefer Elemental Weapon just for the additional sustain. It's about a 300 magicka difference between the two skill costs, but when you consider how long a fight can be, that 300 magicka, multiplied over several spammables, that does start to add up in terms of how much magicka you're saving. Bound Aegis here. This is slotted for the max magicka. Mage's Wrath is our execute, Inner Light, and then Fiery Rage. You must use Fiery Rage if you are using Elemental Weapon, because you do need a Destro Staff ability slotted in order to gain the Ancient Knowledge passive. If you're using Force Pulse though, you can replace this with something like Shooting Star to gain some even a little bit more Max Magicka on your front bar. I would still stick with Fiery Rage though, just because it is a more powerful AoE ultimate than our Shooting Star or the Storm Atronach, which is going to be our primary damage ultimate. That's going to be on our back bar here. Then our rest of our back bar, we have Haunting Curse, Liquid Lightning, Balance. This is going to be used for our sustain. You're going to be very mindful of when you need to use Balance, because it does drop your health in exchange for Magicka. In a trial scenario where you're getting heals from the healers, constant heals, it's not that big of a deal, but you still want to be very mindful of when you're hitting Balance. Obviously you don't want to hit it, for example, when you're going to potentially get hit by some damage, because again, you are cutting your health by a fair amount here in order to use Balance. So that's just be mindful and really know the fight before you start using Balance. If you don't want to use Balance though, you can replace this skill with Channeled Acceleration if you'd like, or you can double slot Aegis. It's kind of up to you whether you want that minor force or not. I like to have Channeled Acceleration for the additional minor force, but that's up to you. You can go with Bound Aegis to have higher Magicka while on your back bar. And block 8 of fire. And we have Elemental Drain here. This is just for the parse, but this is actually where our shield would be, either Conjured Ward or Empowered Ward. Hardened Ward will give you a little bit stronger damage shield. It'll give you about 20% additional damage shields. But Empowered Ward will give you minor intellect, which gives you additional Magicka regen. So it's kind of whichever one you want to choose. I prefer to go with Empowered Ward for the minor intellect, but you can go with Hardened Ward instead. It's kind of whichever one you want to pick. Now going over our CPs, we have 250 CPs to spend on each of the 3 different colors. So starting off with our green CPs, 75 into Arcanist and 75 into Nasty. That leaves 100 points, which you can put into the remaining nodes however you would like. I personally have 40 into Shadow Ward, 31 into Tumbling, and 29 into Warlord, but you can split them up however you'd like depending on which sort of passive that you want to have. For our blue CPs, I'm optimized around having Alkosh in group, which is why I have 11 points into Spell Erosion. That's just to get myself up to penetration cap while Alkosh is active. But if you aren't running Alkosh and you're using the Apprentice, you will have to put a lot of points into Spell Erosion, probably around 40 to 50 points into Spell Erosion. So that's something to take into consideration. So just be mindful of that. Just try to hit the penetration cap of 18,200, whether that's using the Lover, the Sharpened Trait, or Spell Erosion. Just try to make sure to hit that spell penetration cap. For the rest of our CPs, I have 61 to Elfborn, 64 into Ellie Expert, I have 11 into Spell Erosion, 23 into Staff Expert, 40 into Master at Arms, and 51 into Thaumaturge. If you do need to start putting points into Spell Erosion, you can shift Elfborn down to 56. You do want to have at least 20% into Elfborn. Then you can shift 56 on Ellie Defender. You don't want to drop Ellie Expert by too much. And you can drop Staff Expert by however much you really need remaining, and then you can put them into Spell Erosion until you hit the number that you need. Oops. Now for our red CPs. For those of you guys who've been following my build videos, you know I like to take a one-size-fits-most approach. And I'll change the CPs depending on the specific trial that I'm running. So, you know, if I'm running AA, I have a certain CP setup that I use for AA, which is going to be different from a CP setup that I run for Hell's Fabrication. And that's just because I do want to maximize the amount of damage that I'm reduce the damage that I'm taking by as much as I can. So AA and Hell's Fabrication and Hellrot Citadel and Sanctum, they all have different sources of damage incoming, so you do want to shift points around depending on the trial that you're running. The balanced approach though is 66 into Ironclad, 56 into Thick-Skinned, 64 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender. Now there are 2 nodes that I do want to draw your attention to, and that's Bastion and Quick Recovery. If you put 11 points into either one of them, then you will get the Field Physician passive, which reduces the amount of damage you take while resurrecting another player by 15%. This is going to be pretty useful for a Magicka DPS because you will typically be responsible for rezzing people because you do have a shield that will be able to last pretty much for almost the entire duration of your res. So being able to reduce the damage that your shield is taking, so it lasts longer, and reducing the damage taken when you don't have your shield up, that's pretty strong to have while you're resurrecting somebody. So I highly recommend you put 11 points into Bastion or Quick Recovery in order to get the Field Physician passive here. Alright, so that's all of the build information, and now let's go ahead and talk about our rotation here. So we'll demonstrate it here on the 6 million dummy. So we will be using the elemental weapon as our spamble instead of force pulse. So starting things off here, first I kind of want to talk about the order of your main dots on your back bar: Liquid Lightning and Elemental Blockade. Liquid Lightning has a 10-second duration, as you can see there, and then Blockade has an 8-second duration. So what you basically want to do is you kind of want to focus yourself around Liquid Lightning and Blockade. So it's basically going to be more or less an 8-second duration. So you always want to cast Liquid Lightning and then Blockade. That's just so by the time you need to recast Liquid Lightning, so let's say now you just recast Liquid Lightning, you minimize the time that your Blockade is down for. Now if you decide to do something like Blockade and then Liquid Lightning, it's basically going to mess up your rotation, mainly because by the time you have to reapply Blockade, there's still 3 seconds left on Liquid Lightning. So if you recast Liquid Lightning, it's basically going to be more or less a DPS loss, because you are basically recasting it early, so you're using more Magicka than you need to. So you always want to do Liquid Lightning and then Blockade. You can do Blockade and then Liquid Lightning, but this will mess up your rotation because now you're basing it around a 10-second duration. Well, you're still basing it around an 8-second duration. However, Liquid Lightning is going to fall out of place more or less because there's going to be the 2-second, 3-second duration of Liquid Lightning, and you basically got to decide, do I want to overcast Liquid Lightning, waste a little bit of Magicka in order to maintain that 8-second duration, or you just take the easy route, just swap it so you cast Liquid Lightning before Blockade, and then you have a much easier 8-second rotation versus the awkward rotation that you get by swapping them over. Now, Haunting Curse, the first hit of Haunting Curse happens after 3.5 seconds, and then the second hit happens after 8.5 seconds. So you can think of Haunting Curse as a 12-second dot. So this doesn't line up very well with Liquid Lightning or Blockade of Fire. So basically what you're going to want to do, so starting off here, so I always like to start off with a ultimate if you got it. So we won't use it because I have to do an actual 6 billion dummy parse. And then you start off with Haunting Curse, Liquid Lightning, Blockade, swap to your front bar. When you get your Crystal Frag procs, make sure to cast it right away so you're not sitting on it. Now you can see here that we won't be able to cast Haunting Curse again. As soon as it's over, I swap to my back bar, cast it, go back to my front bar, finish my rotation, and then do my back bar rotation there. So that's basically how you want to play Haunting Curse. It's not always going to line up very nicely with your reapplication of your back bar dots, so sometimes it'll go off while you're just starting your front bar rotation or in the middle of your front bar rotation. When that does happen, just do a bar swap, recast Haunting Curse, and then swap back to your front bar and continue your spamble until you have to reapply your dots on your back bar. When I do the full 6 million dummy parse, you'll be able to see what I mean by that. Now, with Crystal Frags, you do want to cast it right as soon as you get the proc off. And that's because if you don't cast it right away and you use another ability and you get a second proc, you're basically wasting that first proc that you got. So you do want to basically immediately use the Crystal Frag procs as soon as you get it. Now sometimes you will get your Crystal Frag procs right when you have to reapply your dots. So let's say you have to reapply your dots right now. You have basically two options here. Some Magsorks like to use the Crystal Frag procs right away and then swap to your back bar, their back bar, and then do their back bar rotation. Other Magsorks just hold on to the Crystal Frag procs while they do the back bar rotation, and when they swap to their front bar, they cast the Crystal Frags right away as their first skill on their front bar rotation. It can go either way. I know Magsorks that pull very good DPS that use either of the methods. I'm one of the ones who prefers to just hold it and then just use it first when I swap back to my front bar after reapplying my dots, but you can go either route. Now for execute, You will typically be dropping Haunting Curse during execute, so you will only have Liquid Lightning and Blockade, and then obviously instead of your main spam bowl, you'll be spamming Mage's Wrath instead, Mage's Fury instead. So that's kind of how you deal with execute. Now for balance, I like to use it every full rotation that I have, so every time I have to reapply my back bar dots. I like to use balance, and you can bar swap out of the animation for balance. You can see there, I still got the magic back, but I didn't go through the full rotation. You can see there, you can bar swap cancel out of the full animation. This is the full animation of balance, but you can bar swap out of it. So I highly recommend that you kind of practice that so you are able to bar swap cancel out of that full animation there. So that's enough talk about the rotation itself. So now let's go ahead and actually do a 6-man dummy parse so you guys get an idea of the full rotation and kind of get a sense of what I mean when I say you kind of want to do a bar swap to your Haunting Curse, apply that, and then swap back to your front bar until you have to reapply your dots. So we are going to be playing at range, so we will be backing up a little bit here so to kind of imitate what it would be like to be at range. Do keep in mind that we are basically staying still this entire parse, and with Siroria we have basically almost in full stacks of Siroria at all times. So it's going to be a little bit inflated compared to an actual raid parse. But on the other hand, with the raid parse we are getting Minor Berserk, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So if you want to compare Magicka Sorcerer to, for example, Magicka Nightblades do have Minor Berserk, so they will end up pulling a little bit higher compared to a Mag Sorcerer because of that. So just bear that in mind when you want to compare parses between Magicka DPS. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our parse. I will be using Spell Power Potions, and I will be using only the Storm Atronach Ultimate. If you do have fights where you need to do basically AoE damage, cleave damage, for example in Theron Archive, the mage, you might want to cleave the mini mages with the actual mage, then you are going to use Destra ulti in those instances and not the Storm Atronach. Let's go ahead and get started then. I forgot to cast balance that time. So I reapply my curse and then I swap back to my front bar and do my spam bowl until it's time to go to my back bar to reapply those dots. So we are getting our health back from using balance, but with our crystal frag procs. There is a passive that returns 10% health whenever you deal damage with a dark magic ability. So that's how we're able to get a little bit of health back with our crystal frag procs from using balance. It's not a perfect solution because it is kind of reliant on getting good frag proc RNG. But it's our only real method of recouping that that health cost. Now we're in executes. So while in execute, you do also want to use frag procs every now and then. We will be dropping Haunting Curse. You don't want to necessarily use it all the time it procs, but you do want to continue to use it in order to give yourself minor prophecy. So there we go. That is our parse there. Taking a look at our numbers, we pulled 37k, so this is pretty much on par with what I've able to pull in the past. So you can see I pulled a little bit higher with previous parses. So 37.6 was the highest that I managed to parse here with Burning Spellweave. Burning Spellweave is generally going to be on the lower end of things when it comes to overall uptime. So you can see here we have 46% on this parse. And then on this latest parse, we got 52% Burning Spellweave uptime. So it is a little bit on the lower end, especially when you compare it to mag decays, but it's still not terrible. The max uptime on Burning Spellweave is about 66%, but with Acuity, you're always going to be pulling pretty similar numbers. So this is the Acuity parse here. So it's 22% using Elemental Weapon, and we pulled 37.5k. So you can see there that the difference between Burning Spellweave and Mechanical Acuity is pretty small overall. And then with Mother's Sorrow, we pulled 37.4k. So again, the difference between those three sets is going to be overall fairly small and fairly insignificant overall. Our main source of DPS is going to be Liquid Lightning and Block 8 of Fire, and then from there it's pretty much all of your main spambles. Ellie Weapon, Crystal Frags, that's your spambles. Haunting Curse is a pretty strong move to use, so you might want to make sure to keep using that. And then light attack weaving is very important to do. One way to make sure that your light attacks are connecting and you're doing pretty good weaving is to take a look at the number of hits that you have and divide it by the number of seconds that you're in combat. So here I have 146 light attacks over 162 seconds. That gives me a ratio of 0.9. So basically I'm doing 0.9 light attacks every second, so that basically means I'm pretty much hitting my weaves on point more or less. So signs of being very, very good at weaving, so not necessarily perfect, but very good weaving would be anything above 0.9 on a dummy. Anything between 0.8 and 0.9 is considered pretty good weaving, but you could still improve a little bit. And anything between 0.7 and 0.8 is decent weaving, so you kind of got the hang of it, but you still need to kind of work on it a lot in order to get above that 0.8 threshold. Anything below 0.7 means you do need to work on your weaving by a good amount because you are missing weaves. And having those weaves is going to be very important, especially in Summerset, because they did change the way that light attacks are calculated out, so they do scale a lot better with Max Magicka. Alright, so that is basically it for this build. If you have any questions, any comments about this build, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I do read all the comments that you guys leave on all my videos. So I hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.